Welcome back. We are back. This is A Rude Awakening. I'm Sabrina Jacobs. War all over this globe. We have, of course, the Iran war. We've got the ongoing war in the Gaza Strip. Lebanon now. We have the Sudan. We have Ukraine. Smaller wars in the Congo, Democratic Republic of the Congo, etc., etc. So, what is the cost of war on the environment? What is the cost of the ecocide being waged on this planet? Here to talk about that is Dr. Lesley Joseph. And Dr. Lesley Joseph is an associate professor of civil engineering at Liberty University. His expertise is in environmental engineering, environmental stewardship, and environmental justice and ethics. And he has published on the topics of war impacts on the environment. Dr. Lesley Joseph, welcome to A Rude Awakening.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here with you.
All right. So this is it's getting scarier and scarier. There's more wars that are happening. It's kind of a ebb and flow. I don't know, as long as I've been on this planet, of war, just all over the world. So talk to us about the cost of war on the environment, namely the war that's happening in Iran, around Iran, what they're doing, what's being done to them, the Strait of Hormuz. Yeah, talk to us about the cost.
Yeah, no problem. So it's important to recognize that war in and of itself will cause environmental damage, environmental harm. It will cause environmental harm. I think what's interesting in these more recent conflicts and more recent wars is that we're seeing these environmental impacts really increase at levels we haven't seen in the past. And we're seeing actors in these wars specifically target environmental infrastructure, aspects of people's environments that they rely on for their well-being, and a continued attempt to really decimate the environments in these areas. And so, if we're thinking, for instance, about the war in Iran, we can talk about how a lot of the airstrikes and a lot of the bombardments have been occurring at oil and gas facilities, at places where Iran generates its wealth and its income and its revenues. And those industries are very polluting in and of themselves. So when you actually attack them, you're releasing those toxic chemicals, those fumes into the air. You're seeing oil spills into the water, onto the land, and you're seeing these chemicals really migrate across large parts of the country and contaminate the environments around them. And so as a result, there have been reports of acid rain coming down in Iran after some of these strikes have destroyed oil depots, and that smoke went into the air and it rained back down on the people that live there.
Mhm.
There's been a lot of discussion about the water contamination in, for instance, the Strait of Hormuz, in the Dead Sea, in those areas where there's a lot of fighting taking place, a lot of artillery exchanges. There's landmines that Iran's placing in the strait to try to prevent traffic. And so it renders those parts of the strait and those parts of the waters unusable and essentially off limits to whoever's interested in either passing through or using that for their own purposes. And so we can see throughout these wars, throughout these conflicts, tremendous environmental damage, tremendous environmental impact, and tremendous harm to people who live in those areas where the environment's being so impacted. And so I think it's important to recognize that all of these impacts are a part of the cost of these wars and of these conflicts, and they should not be ignored when we discuss the true nature of what war brings to a country or to a people.
Most definitely, most definitely. So, and there's actually an article that you wrote. I mean, it's almost a year old in the Newsline magazine, but it's still very important right now at this moment. It was specifically about the war in Gaza, and you discussed how the impacts of what has happened there, the refugee camps, the contamination of water. But talk to us a little bit more about it. Let me just give the title of that article to everybody that is listening. The toxic blowback of Israel's bombs, how military action in Gaza is polluting the land, air, and water far beyond the enclave's bounds. So that's, let's see, from the 29th of July, 2025, New Lines Magazine. I'll have the link on the show description page for A Rude Awakening at kpfa.org. So, Dr. Lesley Joseph, talk to us about, let's drill down a little bit more.
Yeah, let's
Um,
keep talking about it. Let's keep talking about it. So I think what's important to recognize in that particular conflict and more broadly with war in general and environmental pollution in general is that it does not stay wherever you think the war is occurring. And so the thrust of that piece that I wrote for New Lines Magazine really highlighted the fact that the environmental impacts of Israel's war on Gaza weren't going to stay in Gaza. It was going to impact Israel as well. The air pollution that they were seeing, the air travels, and people on the border of Israel and Gaza are seeing impacts to their air quality. They're seeing toxic chemicals and fumes migrating across the border into their country. We're looking at things like the pollution that's moving into the Mediterranean Sea from untreated sewage because the wastewater treatment plants in Gaza are destroyed or they are deprived of electricity to run and operate. That Mediterranean Sea is a water source for various countries along that coast, not just the Gaza Strip. And so when that gets polluted, those impacts also affect other people beyond Gaza itself. And when we think about the idea of generating all of this toxic waste and rubble and debris from the bombings and the destruction of homes and schools and hospitals and other medical facilities and other civilian infrastructure that's occurring during this war that's being waged, all of that waste has to go somewhere. Someone's going to have to remove that waste from the Gaza Strip in order to rebuild and to reconstitute that society. Where is that waste going? Who's going to remove it? Where's it going to be placed? Those kinds of impacts will undoubtedly affect more than just the people who live in Gaza. And so when I think about that war in particular and the way that's being waged and the sheer levels of destruction that are taking place on its environment, that article really wants to highlight that those impacts will not remain in Gaza alone. And those impacts include, like I said, air pollution, water pollution, groundwater pollution. The aquifers are being polluted as well. The land, the soil, the infrastructure has toxins in it. A lot of the buildings are old. There's asbestos there. Lead paint that gets dispersed and, pressed into the environment once those buildings are destroyed.
mhm.
Particulate matter and dust. And when you think about the human cost, the human health impacts, those also don't stay there either as people contract different infectious diseases, different waterborne diseases from having a lack of clean water and sanitation service, a lack of medical care and facilities to get their injuries treated and their wounds treated and their sicknesses dealt with. We have to remember, before the war, these hospitals were treating people who were sick, people
Mm,
who needed medical attention. You
right?
add to that the calamities that are coming from this war, and now you have a healthcare crisis that will not stay. The refugee camps, there's disease spreading throughout them. As people leave the strip and try to find safe havens and safe passage, they're taking those illnesses with them and looking for treatment. And so all of these impacts from the war will not remain in the Gaza Strip. And all these impacts are becoming more and more common throughout the world as these wars are being waged. And so we have to really consider that and think about that because even though we may believe that it's unfortunate that certain areas are being, destroyed and the environment is being decimated in these ways, it will not remain in those particular areas. It will spread, and we will have to reckon with it in one way or another.
Absolutely. Very well put. Yeah, so Dr. Joseph, and the second, no, is it the second? Yeah, the second paragraph from your article in New Lines magazine, you lay it out. Again, the toxic blowback of Israel's bombs
Hmm.
from the 29th of July, 2025. Dr. Lesley Joseph, you write, and might be a little bit redundant. We're just going to repeat it again here. Chemicals released or created by bombs that will increase chances of birth defects, cancer, respiratory problems, and heart disease are spreading through the air, water, and soil. Given the way these substances travel, their effects will be felt far beyond Gaza. Just like you said, uh, perchlorates will travel to Israel in the water supply, blocking the thyroids of citizens and leading to birth defects and fertility issues. Untreated sewage, just like you said, will spread through the Mediterranean, reaching countries along the coast, including Lebanon and Syria, poisoning drinking water supplies. Particulates in the air will be blown into Israel and Egypt, leading to increased respiratory illness and heart disease for anyone in their path. And the carbon released is in large enough quantities to measurably increase climate change affecting every person on the planet. Wow, absolutely devastating consequences we are heading for. It seems with all of these so called victories from one side or the other, they're not victories at all. Do you see the end of our planet coming sooner than later, Dr. Lesley Joseph?
Well, with what's interesting is when we think about the kind of global climate impacts
Hmm.
of war, they often far exceed the types of industries that we think about when we think about air pollution and climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. And even when you think about the infrastructure that continues to produce the wars that we're seeing, all of that is damaging the environment, all of it. And so I do think that if we do not find more diplomatic, more political solutions, more, approaches to dealing with conflict that don't involve war,
Hmm.
we will push ourselves further and further toward a reality where the world and the earth and the resources become scarce, the air becomes unbreathable, and we create an environment that is uninhabitable for those of us who rely on it, which is every single person. And so when we think about that, I do think that we have to be mindful of that reality, right? And for me, as someone who does a lot of environmental justice, I do like to center the more vulnerable populations and communities that get the brunt of that first, who
Right.
don't have the resources to insulate themselves from those impacts directly. So, for instance, in these wars, there's a tremendous increase in greenhouse gas emissions. There's an increase in pollution. There's an there's a decrease in the availability of resources that we need to sustain ourselves, right? The land gets polluted, the resources become scarce, or they're consolidated by the conquering, factions or the
Hmm.
corporations who seize control of certain areas. And so what ends up happening is that there's less to go around and there are few people in control of those resources. And so those of us who are vulnerable, those of us who are on the margins, it's not available. And so
Right.
now we have issues. We have issues paying for our food because the prices are sky high. We have issues with fuel to be able to travel, go to work, visit family, do things that normal people do. We can't do that anymore because the resources are so scarce.
Hmm.
Um, we find ourselves having to come up with other technological advances to try to blunt the impacts that we're having on the climate and the environment. And it becomes this very toxic cycle that we just cannot get ourselves out of until we break the cycle, come out of it, and think of other ways to deal with conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes even beyond the direct engagement with other countries in terms of war. We have to also consider the ways in which the military industrial complex as a whole contributes to climate change and contributes to the degradation of our environments. And so
Mm-hmm.
there have been numerous studies that talk about things like PFAS, the forever chemicals, and heavy metals being in the soils and in the air around military bases. And there's a lot of discussion about how energy intensive these installations are in terms of consuming fuel for large vehicles, for operations, and for maintenance. And so just the infrastructure itself that we maintain in order to be able to conduct war in and of itself is polluting and harmful and devastating to the environment. And so all of that has to be taken into consideration if we're serious about reducing the kind of impact we want to have on the environment as a whole. You
Mm-hmm.
know, we have,
Right.
we talk a lot about fossil fuel industries and we want to move to renewable energy. We want to do different things and have a just transition to different fuel sources. But what about this ongoing kind of militarism that we continue to fund and fuel
Mm-hmm.
and promote and project out into the
Exactly.
world? What impact is that having on the environment? I would argue it's a very devastating one that we need to be mindful of and somehow combat.
Exactly. Exactly. Well said. Well said. Well, and Dr. Lesley Joseph, we have just run out of time, but this is the first of many conversations. Folks, that was the voice of Dr. Lesley Joseph, and he is an associate professor of civil engineering at Liberty University. And his expertise is in environmental engineering, environmental stewardship, and environmental justice and ethics. And he has published on this topic of war impacts on the environment. Dr. Lesley Joseph, thank you so much for being on A Rude Awakening. Truly appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation.